The seminar today is co-hosted by Birzeit University, the Engineers Association Jerusalem Center, the Royal Danish Academy Institute of Architecture and Technology, and Bhavna Jaimini. My name is Ingeborg Hau. I am a curator and moderator here at the Royal Danish Academy, and also a part of the host group behind this seminar. The seminar today is the first in a mini-series focused on rebuilding. It's part of a project that is an ongoing project that we are working with. And now I will pass the word to Natalia.
Thank you so much, Ingeborg, and it's great to be here today. To rebuild for a sustainable future, we must understand the place, the culture, the community, and the people that needs and are doing the rebuilding. That's why we are working on the rebuilding project across geographies, across cultural differences. And this is where this lecture series is situated, within a conversation hoping to bring an understanding of architectural heritage and current building practices in Palestine. Thank you so much for being allowed to be part of the introduction of the lecture today. Back to you, Ingeborg.
Thank you, Natalia. And now we would like to ask our good friend and collaborator, Nadia Harash, to introduce the Engineers Association and Birzeit University.
Good evening, everybody. I would like to start by expressing gratitude on behalf of my gratitude on behalf of the Engineering Syndicate and the Architects Association and Birzeit University for arranging this session under the reconstruction program, which is part of the International Union of Architects it was under the Union of Architects conference. During this conference, I had the honor to meet Natalia Moshin, and she promptly suggested the idea of launching a series of seminars or webinar to shed light on the architecture in Palestine. I think this was a great idea, especially during the situation that Palestine is passing right now and what's going on and happening in Gaza. So I think it was just like on time, and it's like the right time to introduce architecture in Palestine to the world and to the students all over. So the roots of civilization actually in Palestine date back to nearly 10,000 years ago. So the first human settlement was at Tel Sultan in Jericho, and it's still there. Since then, this geographical area has witnessed succession of civilizations due to its geographical location and on the trade routes or routes, and due to its moderate climate. So since then, this area was occupied all the time by people and different civilizations that passed here, and actually also there is a certain importance for this for Palestine, because Jesus was born here also, and the prophet night journey was also from here, from Jerusalem. So but actually, unfortunately, Palestine is subjected to Zionist occupation and colonization since 1984. It's 75 years ago. Israel was established on Palestine land, and at that time they seized 77% of the land. And then in 1967, the rest of Palestine was under occupation until now. But despite of that, the Palestinian people are still struggling to get their freedom, to get their democratic state. And I'm sure you are following up what's going on in Gaza now and see the horrific ethnic cleansing and also how do you call it? Genocide that is going on now in Gaza. Anyway, this is not our subject right now, but I just wanted to make this introduction to let people know that this land was, there was civilization on this land in Palestine since 10,000 years ago, and it's not only recent, and it has always been occupied with people and different, let's say, civilizations passed here. I will leave you with the lecture to get to know and get introduced to the architecture in Palestine and maybe help you in this case to understand more the situation we are passing through, where our architecture and not only people is subjected to demolition, destruction, and all this kind of action. So thank you very much again for this collaboration. And I hope that this lecture and the whole series would be informative for our students and colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for that introduction. And also thank you for shining a little light on the situation that is ongoing. As we all, of course, are aware. We know, of course, that this is a very rich and very long history of architecture and urban history. So, of course, this small series will never be sufficient. But I, for one, am very excited to get a little bit smarter about the history of the Palestinian architecture and the cities and the settlements. And I hope also that all of our attendees will take this opportunity as sort of an opening into, as you also explained, Nadia, a very long, very rich and very inspiring history to dive further into and get even more understanding of. So without a lot of introduction, I would like to pass the microphone to our first lecturer today, Mr. Abdalrahman Kittana, who will be introducing architectural practices in the Palestinian late Ottoman period. Abdalrahman will present for about 20 minutes to half an hour, I think. Let me just check, 20 minutes or so. And will give us an insight into this part of the history. So please, if you would, Abdal, then I will pass the word to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all for inviting me and for attending this presentation. I'm excited to be presenting for you today some of my research that I have conducted in my hometown in Palestine, the city of Nablus. And actually, this is a photo that I like from Nablus, which shows the old town of Nablus, or the Kasbah, as well as it shows the modern tissue that started to emerge in mid-20th century. And in this presentation today, I'm going to talk about several architectural practices, so mainly about practices that can help us understand how the Kasbah was produced. And the materials that I'm presenting tonight are based on an ongoing research that I'm still working on, and that it studies the building dynamics in the city of Nablus particularly, and during the Ottoman period. So for those who are not very familiar with the geographic locations of Palestine and Nablus, here is the Palestine, and in the red you can see we can see the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and Nablus is in the north of the West Bank. I highlighted it in red here. So, although I'm going to present the building dynamics during the Ottoman period, I have to note that this Kasbah that I'm talking about today is an output of 2,000 years of urbanisms, actually. So it's 2,000 years of construction, destruction, reconstruction, 2,000 years of wars and revolutions, as well as progress and prosperity. So life continued in this particular spot for more than 2,000 years, since the Roman time. And since 2,000 years, this Kasbah is producing itself, and this, what we see now, is an output of all of these 2,000 years. However, the majority of the built tissue that we see in Nablus nowadays dates to the Ottoman period, and this is the period which we have archival materials that help us understand its development. So, as most of other cities in the pre-modern Arab world or Muslim world, the Kasbah can be described by many attributes like Labyrinthian, organic, spontaneous, chaotic, irregular, informal, and so on. And I think those who are interested in architectural history understand the meaning of these labels for the Muslim city. And actually, it fits with the old town of Nablus. However, I will explain that it's not exactly this way. But if we go inside on the ground, when we delve inside the built tissue, we see that the conditions are more sophisticated. For example, we notice a three-dimensional entanglement like this house, for example, that you see now. So these three plans are for one building, one house. And as you can see, the ground floor level is completely different than the first floor level, and both are different than the second floor level. And you can also see that there are different colors. These different colors are for different families that inhabit this building and divide it into multiple units. The only shared area is the areas in red here. So these are common spaces like staircases and some courts where people can utilize themselves. And also, we can also, in the old town, when we move through the old town, we can see long segments of tunnel-like streets where pathways are covered by buildings, creating what we can say that it is an overground tunnels. These are pathways that are kind of public, so everybody can walk through. And you can see that in many places we can walk even 50 or 60 meters, 50 or 60 meters under these buildings. We can also notice the existence of hierarchical movement system in the old towns, that it goes from the public realm to semi-public to semi-private to private. And even further, we can notice there is a confidential movement options in between neighboring houses and private spaces, like this woman on the last image here, that she's moving from her house to her neighbor's house through the rooftop of their neighbor's house, and then goes to the courtyard, and then instead of going to the street. So how was all this created? And was it a chaotic process? Did it lack an order or a system? Actually, in general, I like to argue here that the development was not as chaotic as imagined. Instead, it was regulated and maintained by a self-regulating and adaptive order that organizes itself over time. In this presentation, for the limit of time, I'm not going to talk about the whole order or the whole system, because also it is still a work in progress. But I will talk about some socio-spatial practices that are produced by this order or system. In general, this generative order comprises three major elements. Firstly, the theoretical apparatus that is the background of everything, and a generative system that adapts and generates itself by the time and by the facts on the ground, and a controlling system. And in this presentation, I'm not going to talk about, as I mentioned, about everything. I will talk only about some of the socio-spatial practices that happen there. This order that I'm talking about, or system, prevailed during and even before the Ottoman period. And it started to disappear after the establishment of the municipality of Nablus in 1869. So since that time, since the establishment of the municipality started to be in charge of regulating the building dynamics according to modernized standards, and it started also to enforce regulations, and later it started to issue building permits for the buildings. But how can we know the societal dynamics and processes that produce this town that we see here, for example? This is the oldest photo taken for the Qasbah of Nablus. The answer lies actually in an appropriate methodology. I adopted a methodology which is to read the archival records that belong to and preserved by the religious court of Nablus. So, the development was based on reading, analyzing, and trying to visualize archival materials that were written to document agreements, claims, or judgments between people, and which were registered at the Sharia court or religious court of Nablus. And the oldest record that I have read goes back to the year 1653, I think. So what can we learn from the archives? Actually, I could learn multiple issues related to the building dynamics during the Ottoman time, including, for example, the societal dynamics that I'm talking about some of them today, and building teams, who builds, who controls, who do what, and building materials, types of spaces, structural elements, and so on. And in this slide, I show an example on the methodology that I followed. So from the narrative of the record that you can see an example here at the lower right corner, from the narrative of the record, I can have a description of the place and also of the topic of the record. And then I specialize the meaning of the narrative, where I can conclude some generations and conclusions related to the dynamics of making the place. So what were the major societal drivers that shaped the Qasbah of Nablus? Was it privacy, defense, kinship, for example, money, power, or what? Actually, during my research, I argued that it was not as much about all these things as it was about freedom, or freedom to act. And freedom to act is the first principle that is responsible for the complexity of not only Nablus, but the city in the Muslim world in general. But how can freedom to act, if everybody is free to act, how can freedom to act control and guarantee equilibrium between people's needs? And this is where I'm going to talk about in this presentation. Within the generative system that I spoke about earlier, there are many principles or socio-spatial patterns that I sometimes call. And tonight I will just talk about these four major principles, actually. These are the decision and counterbalance, and parts of a whole concept, reciprocity, and right to utility. So decision and counterbalance entails that every construction process in the old town passes through a roadmap that contains a decision and counterbalance. And decision and counterbalance means that we have two distinct rights, the right to act and the right to react. The right to act, it is the right that any party, it is whether it was an individual or a collective, possesses the freedom to act concerning the development of their own spaces. On the other hand, this freedom is counterbalanced by the right to react based on the principle of prevention of harm and damage. So these prevention of harm and damage and right to act and freedom to act are principles that control the activities. However, these two rights are controlled by what we call the mulkiya rights. And mulkiya mulkiya is an Arabic word, but it refers to a type of relationship between a party and an object. And it has three distinct rights. So you can see in this illustration here, between the party and the house, for example, there is the mulkiya type. And these rights are the right to control or control the changes on the house or the building, the right to ownership, and the right to use. So given these circumstances, the right to act and the right to react ensure an equitable equilibrium between neighbors, and reduces the harm to neighbors or public good or passersby. And based on this, I imagined this roadmap for decision-making in the Kasbah of Nablus. The green line here is normally when it is about full property rights. So when a party holds the three rights that I spoke about: ownership, control, and use. And here, or sometimes when there is an agreement between different parties. And actually, this explains why in family clusters in any Arab city, in the family clusters or rahwash, there is an infinite number of layouts and spatial arrangements, because simply, in most cases, the process goes according to the green line. There is no objection because it is one family that decides everything. So within the cluster, most rights are held by one party, which is the family, and that's why there will be no objection. Then there is a complete freedom to act within this cluster. So what can be possible motivation for the activation of right to react? Of course, this is not out inside. Normally, it can happen inside the family cluster, but mostly outside the family cluster. Actually, all parties within the cluster or outside the cluster, that their rights are violated by the decisions made by others, have the right to react. And for me, the types of complaints that I came across in my readings included different types of harm, like, for example, the violation of rights to passage, the violation of rights to privacy, to presidency, to sunlight, air, safety, visual aesthetics, and many others. But also, if the action is causing or creating pollution, for example, or noise, or smell, or it causes the property price to be reduced. All these can be motivations for activating the right to react. So once complaints are presented to the Sharia judge, if someone wants to complain against a neighbor or someone else, he goes to the Sharia judge. And then the Sharia judge or the religious judge of the city has to act. And his opinion will be based on the examination of the claims by the parties and by making an observation, on-site observations, and also by witnessing the local social norms and customs, and finally by relying on religious fatwa or religious opinion from the fiqh, the Islamic fiqh or Islamic Sharia. And for example, this is an example of a complaint that a claimant complained that his neighbor sets fire in an oven in his private courtyard. So the neighbor is setting fire in a private courtyard, but the smoke intrudes the neighbor's apartment and results in harm and discoloring of the walls. So the judge went to make an on-site examination, and he determined that the smoke is causing harm to the neighbor's residence. And he ordered that they are obliged, the neighbors, not to set fire in that place. Maybe they can move it to another place. And here is another example. A claimant complained about 2 windows in a neighbor's dwelling overlooking his private courtyard, thus violating the right to privacy and of his female members or female occupants. So the judge, again, with an architect and witnesses, went to the house and he conducted the observation, and he determined that these windows overlooked a pathway leading to the courtyard. And this pathway itself is not a private space according to the norms. And also he concluded that the windows predated the private ownership of the courtyard. So they enjoy the right of presidency. Consequently, the judge dismissed the claim based on his observation. And of course, the judge provided a fatwa or a religious opinion to support his decision. So the second principle that I'm talking about is the principle or concept of parts of a whole, which entails that every building as an entity is composed by the assembling of numerous components capable of being shared, interchanged, or transacted. While the whole refers to the entire whole of the building or architectural artifact, the parts can be different in different natures. So it can be functional spaces like complete room or staircase or a yard or sometimes a kitchen. It can also be an architectural element. So it can be a rooftop, a structural floor, it can be a wall, it can be side of a wall, and it can be part of a wall, and sometimes it can even be an arc, okay? And sometimes even 1 meter from the wall. So these are elements of the house that can be transacted. And also it can be shares in percentage of the total house. And this actually idea or concept is very useful to understand the nature of reciprocity in the old town, or what Basim Hakim calls the interdependency. And reciprocity in my understanding here describes the mutual exchange of servitudes and architectural elements and structural support, whatever, among neighbors to manage their everyday life. And in practice, reciprocity entails different transaction types, like the transaction of ownership, of use, or of control. It also entails different scales of transactions, like complete building, for example, or individual spaces, rooms, architectural elements, windows, or, as I mentioned, part of a wall or even a structural arc. And there are different methods as well to make these transactions, like sale or long-term lease, like 100 years, or rent, inheritance, or exchange between neighbors, or sometimes gift or a donation. And this is an example of such a process. Here, Ibrahim Basha wanted to expand his house, which is in orange here, above the store underneath his building. So the owner of the neighboring store accepted to lease the rooftop to Ibrahim Basha for 99 years. So he can build above the rooftop of his store. Then Ibrahim could build and expand, build a new room and expand his dwelling. And we can see the result in the last illustration, where there is an entanglement of properties in this arrangement. This is another case. Here, Arafat bin Hijazi wanted to build above the yard that we see in the first illustration here. And he also wanted to support the building that he wants to build above the yard on the wall of the neighbors. So they made a deal, he and the neighbor, that they made a lease contract for 99 years in a condition that the resulting space underneath the new building that you can see here in the last image here will belong to the Sharabi house. So it becomes a full property of the Sharabi house. So Ibrahim or Arafat bin Hijazi cannot claim that he owns the rooftop of that space. So within all these entanglements, how could houses be utilized and manage the essential infrastructure, for example? And this takes us to the concept of preserving the rights to utility and benefit. So the rights to utility are exclusive rights of the property over another adjacent property or space, so it can be able to be utilized through. And it is important to emphasize here that utility rights belong to the building itself, even if the owner changes. So it is associated with the building, not with the occupiers or users or owners. And the most frequent essential utility rights that I came across were the right to passage, as you see here in this illustration. So the rights are associated to the building, and these rights are either the right to passage, the right to drinking water, the right to drainage, and the right to elevation, where I have the right that you, because you are underneath me, to elevate me, and you don't have the right to demolish your house even if you own it. And also in the lower illustration, we can see the drawings of the possibilities through which a property can secure its utility rights. So it can be through direct connection with the street, or through the common space in the cluster or in the house, or in many cases, I saw that it was managed through the neighbor's property. So they made an agreement with the neighbors that they dug or make a tunnel or something underneath their building to connect with the drainage, for example, in the house or in the cluster. So finally, this is what I wanted to talk about, the practices. It is a bit, it was always complicated for me to describe it, but I tried to manage to describe it shortly here. And finally, this is the plan of Nablus that was drawn at the late Ottoman period. And here we can see the built tissue that was mostly built following the multiple principles that I mentioned and other principles. And this map was drawn in the year 1900. And here you can see a map of the modern neighborhood that started to emerge in the late 19th century after the municipality started enforcing some urban rules, most particularly setbacks and open spaces. So to the left here at the end, we see the end of the old town, but here we start to see buildings are having setbacks and they are loose and segregated in the landscape. And finally, the last slide. This is the type of master plans for modern neighborhoods produced by the municipality also in the late 19th century. So this plan for the same neighborhood that I showed before, it is for Shwetre neighborhood. It was produced in 1889. And actually, it shows that it started to identify modern streets, boulevards, and also you can see the section here where they also regulate the heights of the buildings and setbacks and so on. So in general, all of these materials and much more were published last 2 months, I think, in this article exploring the intersect architectural fabric of a historic Arab Medina. And here is the link, and I can put it on the chat link if someone wants to have it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abdalrahman, for a very inspiring presentation. Before we move on to the next speaker, we just have a very specific question in the Q&A related to your presentation from Hassan Chachuk, who asks, the requirements, demands of REACT in the construction process will always be after the construction is finished, ? So REACT will always be a post-process and never a pre-process, ? Could you just give a little more information regarding the question of our...
This is a very good question. And in the roadmap that I showed, that the image that it can happen during the construction. Mostly it happens during the construction, and sometimes even before the construction begins, because neighbors know the intent of others. But this principle reserves the right that even after the reconstruction, after even being inhabited, it can be demolished. And if there was more time, I could have shown you some materials where the judge ordered the demolition of the wall and to move it about 15 minutes, about 15 centimeters, because these 15 centimeters were violating the right to access, for example. So it happens during and it happens afterwards.
Okay, thank you so much for a more specific answer to that part of your presentation. So for now, thank you so much for showing us a little sneak peek into your extensive work on the architectural history and your current research. So now I would like to pass the words to our next speaker, Mr. Nadi Abu Sadeh, who will be talking about the urban history. The title of his presentation is Toward an Anti-Colonial Urban History, Planning Modern Jaffa. So please, Nadi, if you would share your presentation, and we will proceed and have the Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me, and thanks for putting this together. My talk today will be about colonial but also counter-colonial planning in Palestine, specifically in the 1930s and 40s, which is when Palestine was under British colonial rule, but was also starting to witness a systematic process of Zionist colonial settlement. And I would like to start with this photograph from the 1930s. Now, you may not recognize this particular site, but I assume that probably many of you would have heard of the city where it is located, which is the coastal Zionist city of Tel Aviv. And there are many reasons why Tel Aviv has been popularized, especially within the history of modern architecture. But the main reason is because it is known as the White City that attracted a lot of European modernist architects, especially German ones, during the 1930s and 40s, and it is even classified as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as you can see here. But what's missing from the celebratory narrative is the historical context that both enabled and shaped these developments, which is that Tel Aviv was conceived as a colonial town since the start. It was founded in 1909 by a group of Zionist colonists who had just arrived to Palestine, and their idea was to form, and I quote, a Hebrew urban center in a healthy environment planned according to the rules of aesthetics and modern hygiene, end quote. And they were quite influenced by the Garden City movement. So they hired Sir Patrick Gibbs to plan their city in 1926. And you can see here the quite organic grid that he's proposing, but actually it was never implemented. But also, if you look at the lower left side of the photo of the plan, you'll see a lot of empty space. But this wasn't really empty space. That's where Tel Aviv ends and Jaffa starts. But there's almost no acknowledgement to Jaffa's existence on this map, which is quite telling of how the colonial erasure of the Palestinian coastal town of Jaffa is embedded in how Tel Aviv is conceived since its very foundations. And so this really starts to raise a very critical question for us as urban historians, which is, how do we construct a narrative of native environments and landscapes that accounts for both the many distortions in colonial history and historiography? And in the past few decades, there has been quite a surge in academic interests in really trying to grapple with the histories of what's been called colonial urbanism. And these are just examples of some of the most important works on this colonial urbanism. And the main interest of these scholars is in how the spatial apparatuses of urban planning and architecture served European imperial and colonial aspirations. Now, of course, all these works are incredibly important and have done great service to the critical study of architectural and urban history. But in my view, this colonial frame is only partially useful to understanding the process of urban change in imperial and colonial settings. And that's for two main reasons. First is that the colonial frame often results in overestimating the coherence of these colonial visions. And second, and I think more importantly, is that it also leads to overlooking other parallel spatial practices that were being forged by colonized populations. And this is especially relevant for our context because the critical works that have been written on Jaffa's history are mostly approaching it through the colonial influence of Tel Aviv, which is important, but I argue that there's more to Jaffa's history than this relationship. So I think to better understand Jaffa's history, we need to situate it within a broader regional environment and geography, which, as we will see, remained quite influential to how Jaffa developed both before and after the establishment of Tel Aviv. Now, there are many reasons behind Jaffa's rise as one of the most important port cities in the Eastern Mediterranean in the modern era, and I will highlight three of these factors. The first factor is the city's strategic location along some of the most important inland routes connecting Egypt to Syria, as we can see from this map. And another really important factor, especially in the 19th century, when a lot of European pilgrims start to visit the Holy Land, is that Jaffa is the closest port city to Jerusalem. So for many of these travelers, Jaffa becomes the main gateway to Palestine, and this is mentioned quite frequently in travel and history books written in this period. And that's especially after the construction of the Jaffa-Jerusalem Railway in 1892. Now, the third and quite important factor behind Jaffa's rise in this period is that Jaffa was a primary center for the cultivation and exportation of oranges. And this tells you how misleading this idea that the Zionists like to pose about Tel Aviv being a garden city in the middle of the sand dunes. And that's because long before Tel Aviv was even founded, Jaffa had already been known as a city of gardens. This is a French map of Jaffa from 1799, and it shows us that a large belt of citrus plantations had already surrounded Jaffa since the 18th century. So while this is the image that the Zionists always like to show when they talk about the foundation of Tel Aviv in the middle of the sand dunes, if you would only turn the camera to the other side, this would have been your view, which is the large belt of citrus plantations that had surrounded Jaffa before Tel Aviv was even built. Now, there are several reasons why Jaffa's orange industry really explodes in the 19th century, and the factors that lead to this are both global and local. So in terms of what's happening globally, I won't go into details, but first there's the development of steamships, which is really important for trade. There's also the relative openness of the Ottoman Empire to world markets and trade agreements with European empires, especially Great Britain. So quite a few elements at play there. But there's also something that happens locally, and this is quite significant, which is that Palestinian farmers were able to cultivate a new variety of oranges, which is what we call Shammuti orange, or simply the Jaffa orange, which is not only sweet and tastes good, but also has a thick peel, which makes it very suitable for long-distance travel. Now, the growing investments in citrus cultivation had a quite remarkable impact on Jaffa's urban landscape, especially its relationship to its surroundings. So between 1850 and 1880, the orange grove area surrounding Jaffa quadruples. And so orange gardens become really the best form of capital investment in Jaffa, and oranges become Palestine's leading export commodity. And if we look at this map of Jaffa and its surroundings from 1878, the city appears in red on the left, and we can see how vast these orange groves really are and how they're forming an entire belt surrounding it. Now, all of this growth in Jaffa's citrus industry and the economic boom that it provoked had a quite substantial impact on the city's trajectory from the late 19th century onwards, which is really a new age for the city's urban development. Now, by the 1860s, Jaffa was still a walled city, and there was a clear line of separation between the city and its surroundings. But with the remarkable economic and demographic boom the city witnessed, and with the relative political stability in this period, these walls start to really become an obstacle for the city's expansion and development. Here we can see the amount of activity and traffic that was happening outside the main gate in the mid-19th century. So in 1855, there's already this petition by Jaffa's residents that is sent to the Ottoman state in Istanbul, demanding the opening of a new city gate to meet, and I quote, the city's development, its expanding trade sector, its doubling numbers of inhabitants, and its increasing density, end quote. And this is quite significant because it really shows us that there's already a strong sense of urban rights among Jaffa's residents quite early on. But it's really in the 1870s that this sense of urban rights becomes more institutionalized, especially with the introduction of the Ottoman Municipalities Law of 1871, which really sets the basis for the establishment of locally elected municipal councils in all of the main cities of the Middle East, and gets carried onto the British and French colonial period. This is a photo of the Jaffa Municipal Council in the 1930s during the British Mandate. And it's important to note here that the archives of the Jaffa municipality, just like the archives of the Gaza municipality today, were mostly destroyed and looted by Israel in 1948, and many documents remain censored. So instead, we have to look for this history in different kinds of records, like newspapers, memoirs, and photographs. And we can talk more about this later if there's interest. But what's significant about these municipal councils is that they really encourage the emergence of a modern understanding of urban space and the city as a whole. So connecting with what Abid was saying. And this is mainly done through the introduction of modern building and planning codes for the first time, which really become the chief instruments for the rationalization of urban space throughout the Middle East. And so one of the first courses of action that this new municipal council in Jaffa takes is the demolition of the city walls and filling up the moat that had once surrounded the city. And this really ushers in a new age of municipal development in the city, turning this area into a hub for new administrative, commercial, and cultural institutions. And many new monumental buildings get built there, like the Ottoman clock tower, the municipal building, a prison, the government headquarters, etc., which we can see in this image. And so this really becomes Jaffa's new center by the start of the 20th century. But this is a time when Jaffa's residential quarters are also expanding outside the boundaries of the walled city. Now, what's important is that well into the 20th century, the citrus industry remains quite flourishing in Jaffa. So this pushes the city's suburbanization away from the citrus groves, which are east to the city, where land was so expensive. And instead, that expansion happened towards Jaffa's southern and northern shorelines. So in the south, you get an affluent residential suburb known as Ajami. And in the north, you get the more working class suburb called Manshiyeh. And here you can see how Manshiyeh was being developed by the shoreline. But of course, another main thing that happens shortly after is the establishment of Tel Aviv right next to Manshiyeh. And this brings us back to the colonial context in which all of this was happening. Now, after World War I, the British occupy Palestine, and they officially endorsed the establishment of a Jewish national home there. This is a photo of British troops in Jaffa on the eve of the occupation. And that's really when all these new spaces that we saw earlier that were built in the late 19th century become more politicized. And it's also when Jaffa turns into a main site for Palestinian resistance of both British and Zionist colonialism. These are photos of mass demonstrations in Jaffa's main square in 1933. And in it, we can see how the British troops were violently suppressing these demonstrations. But the most drastic British campaign in Jaffa took place a few years later during the 1936 Great Revolt in Palestine. And that's when the British decided that they needed to intervene in Jaffa's urban fabric as a form of punitive measure against its population. And they focused their campaign specifically on the old city and not on the new suburban developments that we talked about earlier. These are aerial photographs of Jaffa from a military report, and next to them is written, and I quote, "The old city of Jaffa had long been a hotbed of lawlessness and revolt, and as such had usually set the example for rebellious activities all over the country," end quote. It also explains that the rumors of a rival port project at Tel Aviv were particularly badly received among Jaffa's population, most of whom were workers in the harbor. But it wasn't just the old city's population that was a problem for the British. It was also the architecture and the built layout of the old city. The British report describes it as a rabbit warren and referred to its streets as dark and narrow streets that turned and twisted like a maze. They also describe how its position on an elevated hill relative to both the sea and the new neighborhoods granted it a vertical advantage over other parts of the city. This is a photograph just to show you the elevated nature of the old city compared to the other part. And so in June 1936, the British started a series of planned demolition activities in the old city. This is a view of the demolition activities from above, and you can see their extent. Now, the British claimed that this was an urban improvement project and entailed, and I quote, the strategic opening of good wide roads through the old labyrinth of alleys, end quote. But from these ground photographs and local testimonies in the operation's aftermath, we know that this was a false pretense for what was a clearly military operation. And it's not difficult to see that in its destruction of Jaffa's historic center, which is really the connecting tissue between the port and the city's new suburbs, the operation violently obliterated the commercial and residential heart of the city. It was, and I argue, a form of de-urbanization, pushing hundreds of affected Palestinian families away from the heart of Jaffa into nearby villages. But of course, the story does not end here. In the last decade of British colonial rule, Jaffa's Palestinian residents made several attempts to take charge of their city and its future developments. And again, the municipality played a significant role in this process. And so in the 1940s, the Palestinian-run municipal council rejects a British colonial plan for Jaffa. And instead, in 1945, they go and hire an Egyptian planner to design a new master plan for the city. And this master plan is quite significant and for several reasons. First, it indicated that Palestinians weren't only rejecting British colonial plans, but that they were able to use the limited power of municipal modern visions and agendas of their urban spaces. And second, it also shows us that until the 1940s, Palestinians conceived of their urban spaces not in an insular geography that was limited to Palestine, but that there was a great interest in the transnational exchange of urban expertise and ideas between Palestine and different Arab countries. But also, once we take a closer look at the master plan itself, we start to see how Palestinians conceived of the future of their city in quite a lot of detail. As we can see here, the plan was quite ambitious. It included schemes for housing projects, transport infrastructures, stadiums, public parks, public buildings, etc. And we can see here that the municipality building is quite central in the plan. So it's really emphasizing municipal power over the colonial administration. And the plan was quite detailed. And so it included a whole section on dealing with the old city, which the British had destroyed in 1936. And here they had to deal with this question of the rehabilitation of this part of the city, also adjusting it to meet the city's contemporary needs. But what we also see in this plan is that there's a broader understanding of Jaffa's geography. And especially here, we see an emphasis on the regional relationship to nearby Palestinian cities like Lid and Ramle, and a lot of emphasis on transportation networks that link roads, railways, and the airport, which was built almost a decade before. But even more importantly, we see that Jaffa's future is envisioned as a city that turns its back to Tel Aviv. And we can see this quite clearly in this radial plan for Jaffa's expansion away from Tel Aviv, which is in the hatched section on the upper right corner. And so in this sense, Jaffa is oriented towards both other Palestinian cities, but also to a broader relationship with the greater geography of the Arab region. And this plan for its time was quite a remarkable one, not only for Jaffa, but for architecture and planning in the modern Arab world more broadly, especially because it was planned by an Arab planner. And so in 1949, it gets published in Majallat al-Amara, or the Journal of Architecture, which is this modernist Egyptian journal of architecture. And in that publication, the plan for Jaffa is recognized as a useful model, not only for Palestine, but for the entire Arab world. But of course, nothing came of the plan. And that's because as Palestinians were planning the future of their city, other plans were being made for them. So in 1947, the UN proposes partitioning Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state. And of course, and very interestingly, Jaffa was to be an Arab enclave within the Jewish state, as we can see here. But of course, this plan never actually happens. And within a few months, the Arab-Israeli war which we refer to as the Nakba of 1948, starts. And Jaffa falls to the hands of Zionist militias, who destroy large parts of the city and ethnically cleanse most of its Palestinian population. And many of these displaced Palestinians become refugees in Gaza, just a few kilometers south. So 1948 becomes a moment of foreclosure, the futurities that were conceived throughout Jaffa's modern history. But these are exactly the kinds of futurities that as urban and architectural historians, we must really try to unearth. And so for this reason, I am convinced that in writing and thinking about the modern history of Jaffa or other Palestinian cities that remain colonized, we must really try to push hard, not only to write the history of colonial urbanism, but also to try and understand what other possibilities or other histories emerge once we push our thinking of cities beyond the colonial frame. And once we really start attuning to the interrupted voices and traces and dreams of their long-term inhabitants. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Nadi. It was really both beautiful and also quite comprehensive insight into the urban history and the difference between the colonized approach and the local approach to planning your societies. And I was just wondering if I could ask you to elaborate a little bit more about the power of local architecture, local architects, local researchers, local professionals being able to commit to the rebuilding of the societies that they are an active part of themselves, because that's something that I think brings the topic of today together with the rest of our rebuilding project, trying to sort of find out what is exactly the power of local anchored architectural and urban development as opposed to being the other way around. So if you could just maybe share a little bit more words on your thoughts on that topic.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent question, and I think resonates with the previous talk, but also, of course, Nadia's work. For me, I think what's important is to remember that the history of the production of Palestinian architecture is a long one. Whether this history is of an architecture that is vernacular, so that is done without architects, or by architects. So I mean, we're looking at plans from the 1930s and 40s, and in Abid's we saw some plans from the late 19th century of basically produced by professionals, by people involved in the disciplines of architecture and urban planning. So there is a long span of Palestinian involvement and local involvement in the decision-making surrounding the future of Palestinian urbanism and Palestinian landscapes more broadly. I think one of the main issues that Palestine faces is that often these voices are not heard. Often the expert is only the foreign experts who come to Palestine, usually with little knowledge about the history, but also about the present of this landscape, of its architecture even. And usually they have the upper hand when it comes to decision making. And of course, so that's talking about foreign planners and architects, but when it comes to Israeli schemes, so colonial schemes for planning, obviously the Palestinians aren't even, in the picture. In fact, these spaces are designed to negate the Palestinian, to remove them very often more often than not, from the space of Palestine, from the historical space that they have belonged to and that they have constructed over decades and over centuries, as we've seen in these presentations and as Nadia was stating in her opening remarks. So I think that is what's important, is that, I mean, we are now at a stage in the discipline of architecture, I think around the world. I mean, I teach at a Swiss institution, and I mean, the main takeaway today in the main lesson of architecture in the 21st century is that local agency should be at the heart of any project, any plan to envision the future of a place. Yet when it comes to Palestine, that agency is often overlooked. And I think that is the main issue. That is the main thing to take away, is why is this an exception to these standard, what has now become standard practice in our field and in our profession. So I think that will be my main message here.
Thank you for sharing a little more of your thoughts and insights on that topic. I think that's really interesting. And before we go to the Q&A, I'll just have a look at the questions in a little while. I'll ask you, Natalia, to share a little bit of your reflections after seeing these really inspiring presentations, first by Abdalrahman and afterwards by Nadi. If you could just maybe tell us a little bit about your reflections after these presentations, and then I'll go through the Q&A as you speak.
Thank you very much, Ingeborg, and thank you so much for these very inspiring presentations. It's inspiring to hear and begin to understand more about the history of Palestinian architecture, but also again, when we share insights across borders, you also, of course, learn something about your own context. So for me, in my context, there was two things that I would really like to discuss with you further and learn more from. And one thing was, Abdalrahman, your presentation of the parts of the whole concept, which I think is deeply relevant for architecture today. And Nadi, you conclude, summing up very beautifully, the local agency, the localizing of what we're doing. And I think that that also speaks very deeply to the conversation we're having in the rebuilding project and altogether between architects across different geographies about the shared need and efforts towards sustainability, both in regard to the organic systems and to human dignity and life, and how localizing our efforts, the sharing, the conversation, as you said, Nadia, the discussions and language we can exchange across borders, leading then back to localized actions, and as you concluded, Nadi, all based on local agency, because what else agency is there? So I think I was very, I'm very pleased to have listened to these lectures, and I hope I will be able to hear more about these elements, which I certainly already are beginning to think about in my own context.
Thank you, Natalia, and maybe Abdalrahman, if you would try to share a little bit of a response to Natalia's reflections first.
Yeah, of course. Actually, thank you for this. And for me, I also thought that this parts of the whole concept is the inspiring part of my research, and it actually the principle that made me search more and more about these dynamics. And the concept of the title of the concept or the terms that I'm using, it's my own, and English is not my native language. So it can be assembled in different forms, the title parts of a whole. But what is inspiring for me that people were perceiving every entity as an assemblage of many elements. And this actually made the flexibility or enabled the flexibility of transactions of these elements with neighbors or with others to facilitate the building of houses or spaces without the need for expanding into other lands or going outside the city. And actually, the compactness of the city wouldn't have been this way if there was no such perception. So in general, I could see that the transactions sometimes could be for even 2 stones. I had a record where 2 stones were transactions, actually. So the neighbor bought 2 stones because he wanted to take these 2 stones out and to put corbels instead and to build above. of course, he owns these 2 stones, but shares usage with the wall. So this complexity is missing now, of course. Property is property, okay? And their neighbors are not allowed to touch. But actually, this issue made the city looks not only complicated, but looks small because the density of population is really high. And an important issue here is that this thing, although it's derived from a hadith or a saying by the Prophet Muhammad, but actually it became a custom even with Christians and Jewish or Samaritans who were living inside the Ottoman. So there was a record where Christian family leased a wall from a Muslim family. Okay, so it becomes a custom, although it was facilitated or inspired by religious background, but after a while it became part of the social norms, and people actually became aware about these norms without referring to the judge. So mostly they build without having any permit from the judge or whatever.
Thank you. Really interesting. I just saw a question in the Q&A that I think relates a little bit to this topic. So if I was just continue, Abdalrahman, to ask you, this is a question, I'll just read it aloud from Basel Beshtari. I believe your presentation about the right to act and react may provide a new non-Western perspective of the right to the city, which may challenge the traditional Western perspective, capitalist/socialist one, especially in the right to the infrastructure. Do you agree with me? Our participant asks. So could you just elaborate a little bit on that, Abdalrahman?
Of course, I completely agree. And actually, there is one element that I didn't mention in the presentation, which is who has the right to the city. Actually, from the Islamic principles, that actually, I should have described this a bit in the presentation, but we have in the Islamic Sharia, we have different schools of thoughts. And these different schools of thoughts produce knowledge or produce ideas that relate to religion, but for political issues that concern, for example, building dynamics. And we in Nablus, we were under most of the time under Maliki or Shafi'i. And these guys, for example, they believe that the street or any unused land is what they called mawat land. Mawat land means that it is dead land or unowned land. So nobody has the right to own it or to claim it unless for a purpose. Even the state, even the government cannot own this land if there is no purpose. Of course, the government or the judge can reserve the land for public use, for future use, but if there is no proper use, he cannot reserve it. And part of this is the street. For Shafi'i and Maliki, they believe that the street is unowned land. So it's not owned by anybody, it's owned by God. And that's why everybody has the right to appropriate the air above the street. So because it's unowned and the street is only for passage, so the air above the street is unowned because the street unowned, the air is unowned. Then you can, what we call the revivification of a space. It is in Arabic, ihya. And that's why in the city of Nablus, for example, we see tunnel-like streets, because as long as you preserve the right to passage in the street, then you have the right to occupy and own the air. And in many cases, I saw documents about he sold the right to the air above his house, for example. And in some cases, he sold the air of a maximum height of 3 meters, for example. Then above the 3 meters, the first owner will become the owner of the air above it. So this kind of thing means that people have the right to the city that is beyond the limits of the governor and beyond the limit of the regulations. And also, this means that they cannot speculate over the city. So as long as you only own if you want to use, then you can't own only for speculation. So you can sell it in 10 years, for example, like what happens in Palestine nowadays. What happens in Palestine nowadays prevent people like me, for example, from many rights to the city, because at the moment when I want to buy, I cannot buy where I want. I have to buy where others make it affordable for me to ride. But this was not the case in the old town. And for the right to infrastructure, as long as it can be adjusted and appropriated with neighbors, then you have a flexibility of arrangements where you can manage these infrastructure activities. But of course, there are many details about these about infrastructure, the right to drinking water and right to drainage. They are a bit complicated, but in general, yes, it makes the city owned by the people and actually used by the people themselves.
Thank you for that that answer. You are right. It is complicated, but also very interesting to discuss, because it's also something that ties different aspects of architecture and the different professions, many different professions and many different community agents involved in architecture come together, I think, in a topic like that, because it's very complex, but also highly relevant in many aspects of our field of profession. So let me just revisit the Q&A. See, there are a lot of questions and also comments about interesting presentations. Thank you for that. Just a small supplement to your explanation, Abdalrahman. Juliet asks, what about the right to sunlight? Is this not an issue? Sunlight, fresh air, all of these very intangible, but highly, highly important
actually,
resources.
In one of my slides, I mentioned that violation of right to the sunlight and violation of right to fresh air. And I saw records where the judge and an architect, they assign the size of the wall and the size of the pathway, so it doesn't prevent sunlight and fresh air from a specific room. So yeah, all things that relate to the human life were actually addressed in this. And even the right to privacy in terms of voice, in terms of sound, in terms of smell. So sometimes, some poor people complain that their neighbors are cooking all the time, and this makes our poor children complain about the smell. So the judge went there and asked the family to cook in different way. So everything can be complained, and everything can be adjudged by by combining the architect and builders and the witnesses.
Thank you. And let me just see. I think we have a question here from Rami. I think it should go to you, Nadi. It's a question about were these late Ottoman urban planning schemes, or maybe it's for both of you. You can raise your hand and see who wants to answer. Were these late Ottoman urban planning schemes present in smaller Palestinian towns like Nasiriyah, Bethlehem, or Ramallah, or restricted to the major cities? Nadi, if you would.
Of course, yeah. Thanks for the question. And urban planning happened in two main ways in the late Ottoman period. One was through the regulation of all building. So you have the introduction of an Ottoman building code that was emphasized on all municipalities to basically abide by. And all of the towns that are mentioned in this question had municipal councils. So they were, in one way or another, abiding by these new regulations. Now, there's a huge variation between how much or to what extent these codes were abided by. And that's why you see, different publications coming out in that period, translating the codes and also writing commentary on their relevance to different parts of the Ottoman Empire, etc. So that is one way in which you got, so through the regulation of existing expansion or happening expansion that was taking place. So that's one form of planning. And then another form was, more deliberate schemes like the ones that Abdalrahman showed, for specific neighborhoods, mostly, you know, new modern neighborhoods, usually affluent ones, usually ones where you have a little administrative center, and around them you have, you know, public buildings of significance. And of those, I mean, we have a few examples from different cities, usually depending also in that time by, depending on interest in foreign investment. So for instance, you had a lot of foreign investment in a place like Jaffa, you had a lot of foreign investment in a place like Jerusalem. Later on, you would have more investment in a place like Haifa, etc. So it depends on whether there was interest or not in the city by foreign actors as well. And I mean, in these towns, and these are all Christian towns like Nazareth, Bethlehem, and Ramallah. And I think what's important to note there is that also missionaries had quite a lot of influence on the architecture of the city, through building compounds that had a very specific layout and usually adhered to European architectural styles and planning schemes. So you would have a combination of things. There was no one master plan, like the case of Jaffa, for instance, that we saw in 45, which is much later. But you would have different schemes for certain neighborhoods, but you'd also have different influences and planning logics. You would have the Qasba, like the case of Abdalrahman, sitting right next to these bigger expansions that are taking place. So I hope that answers, in a way, the question, or at least addresses it.
I think it does. And now we have time for one last question before we sum up the session today. And we have one here from Runa, who asks you, Nadi, in your view, where should one start in order to form agency for local Palestinian knowledge to guide rebuilding as well as development? So I think Runa's question is sort of linking back to the local agency that we were touching upon earlier as well. So where should one start in order to form agency for local Palestinian knowledge to guide rebuilding as well as development? If you would comment.
Yeah, I think I would just rephrase, and I wouldn't say that we are forming Palestinian agency. Palestinian agency is there, but I think it's about how we acknowledge it and how we support it. And I think historically, and I think this links back to the earlier comments of Natalie and also Abed, in terms of where is this local agency rooted? And when it comes to urbanism or to urban planning, I think you see it in flexibility, in the flexibility of institutions. I mean, the Sharia courts at some point in the 19th century were an institution that governed the city with a certain degree of flexibility, right? Later on, when municipalities were formed, there was still also a degree of both openness and to some extent, because there were also elitist institutions, but there was still some degree of openness and local involvement in the process of decision-making about the city. The issue is that what you get later, so what you get with the British is a deliberate demunicipalization of Palestine. So they weaken these municipal councils that were locally elected and democratically elected, and instead introduce more central planning, regional planning institutions that take away that Palestinian agency over their own lived spaces. And today, I mean, much of what you experience in Palestine is precisely this inability to act within your own land. I mean, even, you know, in Palestinian-controlled areas, you would still have restrictions imposed upon you in terms of how much you can dig for a well, where you can build or cannot build, you know, what kinds of permits you have, mind you, the confiscation, etc. So I think it has turned, whereas the question of agency is often a social question, and a question that is regarded also sometimes in technical language. I think it has turned into also a political question, that there's a denial of agency across the board, in a political way against Palestinians and their forms of habitation in the land. And the inability of even the Palestinian institutions, whether it's a municipality, whether it's a village council, whether it's something else, to operate even within its own jurisdictions. So I think that, yeah, I think the answer becomes a political answer rather than merely an architectural or a technical one.
That makes sense. Thank you for elaborating on that aspect as well. Before we close the seminar, I just want to repeat a little bit of practical information. As you know, this is a part of a mini-series, meaning that we will be hosting a seminar again exactly 1 week from now. It will be the second one. There are 3 in total. For now, there might be more, who knows? But we will meet again in a week, and we hope, of course, all of you participating today would like to join us next Wednesday for a session on war, architecture, and urban resilience with 2 speakers as well. And we also have some questions in the Q&A regarding where will the content be made available. So we have recorded this webinar and we will post it. Nadia, you will post it on the Engineers Association's webpage. And I think we will also try to share it on our institute's YouTube channel. And we can link to that in an email that we will send all of those of you who signed up today. We'll send a follow-up email tomorrow, also with the link to the profiles of the speakers and of course to the next seminars in this mini-series. And we might also include some of the questions in the Q&A to the speakers afterwards, because they are very specific. So we will send them to Nadia and Abdalrahman and Nadia afterwards and ask them to provide links for more information or stuff like that that might be relevant for you when we send out this follow-up tomorrow. But for now, I just want to thank all of the participating speakers and the attendees, and then I will pass the final word to my colleague Natalia, who wants to sum up also and give a brief thank you before we close this session.
Thank you very much.
Natalia, if you would.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to thank our speakers. I also wanted to thank the team behind the rebuilding project, those who are here today, but also those who are not, and especially writer and urban practitioner Bhavna Jamini, who should have been our moderator today, but for some reason lost the connection early in this seminar. We hope to see her again when we meet next time. And a special thank you to you, Ingeborg, for stepping in with absolutely no notice today. That was great, and I'm really happy that again that these conversations on rebuilding can happen in such a spirit of collegial teamwork across different geographies. So thank you so much for the presentations, and thank you to all in the audience for the good questions.